us all the stones that were in that mound, that of the mighty works that you did, that we have a responsibility too, Lord, because you were very much involved in the nation we have today, 250 years. We thank you, Lord, for all that you have done, are doing, and will do as we humble ourselves in your presence. In your name, Jesus. Amen. I'm going to do something different today. We're going to pass out. Oop, here it is. I'm not going to pass out literally. We're going to pass out the stamp I have for you. This happens to be one of my favorite. George, did you hand them out to me?
I would love to. This would be a...
You should have let me do it.
No.
I'll give you yours.
Oh, no. It's not... Yeah.
I want you to have these beforehand because of the three figures that are on it, and we'll discuss that as we're going. This is from 1931. This was a stamp, a real stamp from 1931. And on it, you probably will not be able to read the names underneath the three portraits. You need some more?
Over there.
Oh, he's got them up there. There you go. So the names are Rochambeau, Washington, and DeGrasse. Okay, they will be important, as we go on here. This is, to me, it is so interesting how God works. Because for those of you who've been here since the beginning, the first week we talked about 1745, 20-some years before the Declaration of Independence. And what was it about? Thomas Prince. He gave the prayer, and who was destroyed in it? France. The French fleet, right? Their armada was devastated by God. Here we are 6 years later, and it'll be because of the French helping us that we'll get our independence. Ain't that something? Because in 1745, France came specifically that Armada was going to destroy all the American colonies on the coast. And here we are 30-some years later, turns around, they're going to help us to win our independence. Isn't God good? Just a little bit of time. Times change. Times change. There you go. I like that. A couple other things. Last week, we talked about the Battle of Cowpens, right? So the Battle of Cowpens, South Carolina. If you recall, the battles now have moved from the north to the south. We'll see that I shared last week. This week we'll see the fact that they're pretty much, it's so funny because they're going to be in New York. The British, a big British army is going to be there, and the Americans are going to be there. Very close to each other, but they're not fighting with each other. They're just kind of laying low there. If you recall, Cornwallis, his group is going to be there. They're bivouacking there because of the fact that, remember, he was so livid, so upset that Daniel Morgan had won at the Battle of Cowpens that he tried to catch him, and 3 times, all of a sudden, providentially, the rainstorm comes to keep the British from catching up to the American soldiers at the Catawba, the Yadkin, and the Dan rivers. And that's because what was happening in the north has now pretty much stopped. What's happening now is the southern campaign. Cornwallis, he's coming down to the south. Clinton out of New York has sent like 8,000 of his troops. They're down there at what will be Yorktown. But again, if you remember, here's Cornwallis and his troops trying to catch up to Daniel Morgan coming from the South Carolina to North Carolina. They're going to go into Virginia. And that's why it'll end up in Yorktown. Now, Yorktown is less than an hour away from where I grew up in Richmond, Virginia. It's just on the coast. And that's why I said when we were kids growing up in grade school, we would go to Mount Vernon, we'd go to Monticello, Yorktown, Washington, D.C. You were taking trips in your school all the time. And that was just elementary school. I left there when I was going to graduate from the 6th grade, but we had already had those multiple trips. In Yorktown, we're going to see at the end a monument that is placed there in honor of the victory, because Yorktown, as you know, is the deciding battle. This will end the war. This surrender takes place there, and that's kind of interesting in itself in that regard, how that happens. But let me move forward here a little bit. I want to move beyond last week. Without supplies and failing to catch Daniel Morgan, Cornwallis and his army were ordered to quarter in Yorktown. until they could be resupplied with both men and goods from England. Why don't you go to that map and let me show? There it is. Good. Thank you. Okay. So right in here is Yorktown. That's where the battle's going to be. This is Cornwallis coming up through South Carolina to North Carolina. He's going to end up quartering here in Yorktown. As a matter of fact, Clinton, who's his boss really, he's up quartering here in New York City. He's already sent like 8,000 men down here to Yorktown to help Cornwallis out. The General George Washington and Lafayette, it doesn't show it here, but over here is Williamsburg. And they're going to be coming this way to Yorktown. And then what's really important is what's happening out on the sea. Because you've got de Grasse here, the French, de Grasse. He's going to be coming up here. And then the commander with the British, Graves, is going to be coming down here. Again, there's so many parts to this puzzle, supernaturally, to me, providentially. But what will happen is also another the part of the British fleet will actually come in here looking for de Grasse, but they missed on the days and they didn't see him. So instead of staying there, they decide to go up to New York, okay, to meet with Graves. So once they meet there, they're all going to come down together, but it gives just enough time for de Grasse, the French, to come into the Chesapeake Bay to be able to unload goods for the American troops. And then Graves gets there like 3 days later, and there'll be a battle. It's called right there, the Battle of the Capes. So when you look up Yorktown, it also may say the Battle of the Capes. That will go on there, and the French will win. Well, it basically is, in a sense, a stalemate, but French win because they get to keep the port. They've been there 3 days, and that will cut off any hope of the British coming in from England with the supplies, they're supposed to come in there. It stops it. So that's going to be pivotal in it. We'll see that in just a minute. On August 14th, 1781, General George Washington and the French General Rochambeau, and you recall Rochambeau, we saw at, I know what it was, Saratoga. At Saratoga, because we won that one, it was unexpected. That's when the French decided to become involved. Okay, remember now, the French and the English have been fighting for centuries. Okay, they're trying to rule the world, and so now the French is watching to see how it's going in America. But because of Saratoga, the Americans winning it, now the French are involved, and so that's why Rochambeau is sent over, and also de Grasse with the sea fleet. Okay, that's why they're over here, because now France believes that the British can be defeated, basically. Is everybody with me on this? Just a little history behind it. General Washington and French General Rochambeau received word from Francois de Grasse, the admiral of the French fleet, that he would be arriving off the coast of Virginia in mid-September. De Grasse would remain in the Chesapeake area for a month until expected seasonal heavy weather forced him south again. So that means that the army under Washington, Lafayette, they've got to get there, okay? And so that's what they're doing. Here was an opportunity to trap Cornwallis in Virginia, but to do so meant that not one but two armies. I mean, we're talking about 7,000 men from one of the armies, the Americans, and then more than that from the French, total like 10,000. And they're going to have to meet together. One of the interesting things I was reading about the history behind this is that the French and the Americans did not get a lot of them didn't get along well together at all. And because of that, there was all sorts of misunderstandings, scufflings, because you have two different cultures. And again, this is not unique, because if anyone how many saw the movie The Chariots of Fire? Yeah. And you remember the scene where the English, it's in Paris, that's where the 1924 Olympic Games were. So the English are talking, and then the French guy wants to do something, but he's not there in the conversation. And so the English says, that's always the way it is with the frogs. In other words, that's because it's 1924, but the battle between France and Britain has been going on for hundreds of years, okay? And we're just kind of caught in it. We saw it in 1745 at the first week. And so those kind of feelings remain. There's different cultures. French and the American culture do not get along well. But the most important thing is that Rochambeau and George Washington got along together really well. Okay, they were in harmony together. They were the rulers of the different armies, so they were able to squelch any difficulties that were going on, and they were able to move in a unified force. Okay. The first necessity of the Yorktown campaign was to arrange the meeting of French naval and American land forces on the Virginia coast at a specified time and place. The junction in Virginia had to be coordinated by two different national commands, separated across an ocean. Remember, we got oceans involved there. We got navies involved here. I should say navy. We don't really have a navy at this point. An ocean without benefit of telephone, telegraph, no wireless. That this was carried out without a fault seems accountable only by a series of miracles. Now think about that for a second. You got a letter that's going to take a long time. He finally gets to George Washington. De Grasse is saying we're going to be there by mid-September as long as the weather holds up. We already saw in one of the other weeks that it took 3 months because of winds that weren't prevailing correctly. As a matter of fact, in the Battle of the Capes between De Grasse and Graves, in that battle, it will turn for the Americans because all of a sudden at 5 o'clock the wind will shift in favor of the Americans in the fight. So again, God's providential hand is throughout all of these things, and you can see it happening over and over again. That's why George Washington wrote that you'd have to be worse than an infidel not to have seen God's hand, providential hand, working in the whole thing. Moving an army. Okay, I just read that. Well, let me repeat that. Moving an army in 18th century America was no easy task. Bridges were nearly non-existent. Roads were trails. And forage was always inadequate to the needs of thousands of men and animals. To further complicate matters, the American and French armies would have to leave their encampments in New York in the face of the large British army stationed there. If their intentions reached British lines, the British would certainly engage the Allied armies. We'll see something about that in a minute. The thing he's talking about here is back up here in New York. You had, as I mentioned a minute ago, you had the American Revolutionary Army, and at the same time you had the British. And it wasn't that many miles separated. It was kind of like when we saw at when the Americans were in the winter in Valley Forge. That's only 30 miles from Philadelphia, and Philadelphia is where the British were. But for different reasons, whether it's weather, exhaustion, lacking supplies, a lot of times instead of engaging, they would just separate. They were close enough to engage, but they didn't engage for one reason or another, because our army, or I should say revolution, is a brutal business. Okay. They broke camp on August 19th. A guard of American militia and Continental regulars was left in New York to cover the Hudson River crossing of the 7,000 French and American troops who were heading south. So what they did was, one night, George Washington decided we're going to head down to Yorktown because he was aware of what had happened down there with Daniel Morgan and that the British were chasing him there and that now we had a superior force down there. So George Washington and Rochambeau are going to go through here. They're going to go over to Philadelphia right there. Then they're going to come down to Yorktown. And to do that, they left in the night, and when the next day, the British were totally unaware of it. General Clinton, who was Cornwallis's boss, he was higher in command, he just missed it totally. They broke camp on August 19th. Okay. On August 19th, a guard of American militia and Continental regulars was left in New York to cover the Hudson River crossing of the 7,000 French and American troops who were heading south. So they left a small contingent there, the Americans did, to give cover, and they were able to escape. The crossing was made without incident, and the joined armies headed south at a rate of 15 miles a day. On September 1st, they reached Philadelphia, 130 miles down the road. On September 2nd, British General Henry Clinton in New York learned that Washington and Rochambeau had slipped away and had just passed through Philadelphia, heading toward Cornwallis. He sent word to Virginia that the Americans and French were coming. On September 5th, Washington discovered that de Grasse had arrived early in the Chesapeake with 28 ships and 3,000 troops. A British fleet, I mentioned this a minute ago, was also cruising toward the bay, but not seeing them, just proceeded up to New York to join the forces there. They figured they weren't there, that it was false information given them. An advanced force of the Continental Army reached Baltimore on September 12th. On September 16th, Washington learned that after an initial skirmish, the powerful French fleet intimidated the British fleet away from the Chesapeake. The bay was now in French hands. I mentioned that earlier. So you've got some coordinating things going on here. You've got the army on the land, obviously going by land from New York. They'll go through Philadelphia. They'll go to Williamsburg. Williamsburg's one of my favorite places to visit, especially during the month of December, because it's all for Christmas, and there's all sorts of things going on there. If you ever have a chance to, it's a really neat thing to experience. On September 28th, historian, whoops, I think I missed something here. Hold on one second. No, I did make mention. Okay. Historian Tushman writes, quote, "The clink of bridles and the rhythmic clomp of horses' hooves and tramp of marching men were heard in the British camp in Yorktown, announcing the approach of the enemy army from Williamsburg. Yorktown was surrounded by 17,000 French." Now think of some of the battles that we've discussed in the past when we were down to like 2,000 men in the troops, The numbers in the American Revolution were always fluctuating. They were fluctuating because, again, we didn't have a highly trained army until Valley Forge, but that was just those there that Stuyvesant was training. So a lot of the time it would fluctuate because people would leave their businesses, they'd leave their farms, they'd leave their areas once they heard that a battle was going on or whatever. But now you've introduced the French, so you've got a formidable group of individuals. You got 17,000 of them. Yorktown was surrounded by 17,000 French and American troops. Cornwallis attempted a nighttime breakout by starting to ferry his regular troops across the York River. Okay, so this is obviously too small, but this is the York River. It would be right on, if that's Yorktown, it'll be on this side here. This is the James River. This goes up to Richmond, where I grew up. And so that's the James River, the York, because he's trying to get over to this peninsula here. General Cornwallis knows he has to escape. He's outnumbered now. The French have cut off the Chesapeake Bay. Nothing's going to come for him now. If their ships, is not going to come because he's already, meaning de Grasse and the French, have gone to battle with the English, and they left and went up to New York in response to that. So the French own it. They own the bay. There's no supplies coming in. Cornwallis sees that, and so he figures his only chance is we got to get everybody out of here. Okay? Yorktown was surrounded by 17,000 French and American troops. Cornwallis attempted a nighttime breakout by starting to ferry his regular troops across the York River. The first group made it safely across the river. However, a sudden and severe providential rain squall blew the second contingent of soldiers downriver, leaving Cornwallis with a much reduced force now. Not only exhausted, not only without supplies, but now there's been a hemorrhage because the first guys made it across there. The second guys, they're all way downstream. That's what the squall did to them. And then what was left with Cornwallis. So now he's got a divided group. He sees the writing on the wall. And so he decides that he's got to surrender. Okay. A British colonel commented, quote, "Thus expired the last hope of the British army." De Grasse's 3,200 French naval troops combined with Rochambeau's 6,000 French artillery troops, then joined with Lafayette and George Washington's troop to pin the British troops against the sea. Altogether, 17,000 American and French troops surrounded Cornwallis at Yorktown, forcing him to surrender on October 19th, 1781. Cornwallis surrendered while a British military band played "The World Turned Upside Down," okay, which is prophetic to me because their world had turned upside down. Britain was chief dog, okay, and we were just colonists who they figured were just too big for their britches, okay. What is interesting, though, is not the English song that was played. What was important, it was what the American soldiers were playing on their, what do you call it, fifes? Is that what those things are? Piccolos and, all that. They were playing. How many have ever heard the song Yankee Doodle Dandy? Yankee Doodle came to town. Called it macaroni. That is not the macaroni you buy in the store. Macaroni was the name of a tavern in England. And the song was British. It was written in Britain. And the people that came to the tavern were not the higher echelon people. And so what they were doing is they were degrading the Americans by that song. They were saying, these are a bunch of buffoons. They don't know what they're doing. Well, and they had every reason to say that because they knew they didn't have an army. It was just this thing that came together. And they saw them, they looked down, the British looked down upon the Americans. And so wherever the British were marching, they were playing that song. Yankee Doodle came to town, riding on a pony, stuck a feather in his cap and called it macaroni. Okay, so that's what they were playing over and over again. So at the surrender, the Americans played that tune to say, in your face. And they had already written new words to it, new verses to it, mentioning George Washington and others. So they changed it from an English tavern song into a American revolutionary song. And it's so funny because in 1978, and that's not too long ago, 1978, the state of Connecticut adopted Yankee Doodle Dandy as their state song. So, I mean, this stuff carries on, folks, through time. It carries on through time. Okay. The Articles of Capitulation. Let me talk about that. When the surrender takes place, the rules of war, the losing side, the winning side will get together, and like the losing side will be concerned about the loyalists here in America. They're going to be worried about their armies, their officers are going to separate out. The officers will be treated differently. And there was I don't know how many, 9-10 articles in the Articles of Capitulation. And interestingly, they were put together by Henry Knox's aide. So Henry Knox was involved in it. Remember, Henry Knox we saw back way before the American Revolution at Dorchester Heights when he was the one that got what? A whole lot of cannons from Fort Ticonderoga. Okay? So he is already, back then in 1775, he has already now moved into position because of his genius in being able to accomplish this, that is highly thought of by General Washington, and he's been all the way through the war now with them, and he'll be the one that helps to put those together. The Articles of Capitulation were drafted by Henry Knox's aide and presented to the British. Cornwallis was to hand over his sword to General Washington, but Cornwallis refused to attend the surrender ceremony, claiming he had an illness. Yeah, I know. Look. No, go ahead. Look. This is honor is a lot on this stuff, okay? And so for General Cornwallis to feign or to have an illness, he should have been there if he was half dead. They should have propped him up, okay? Because if you recall back in Saratoga, General Washington, when he was receiving the sword from the British commander there, he didn't want to embarrass him, so he took him in the tent and did it there. So now this is a tremendous slight for him to do it this way. So what happens is, I'll read to you a quote. Cornwallis refused to attend the surrender ceremony, claiming that he had an illness. Instead, Brigadier General Charles O'Hara led the British Army onto the field. O'Hara first attempted to surrender to Rochambeau, who shook his head and pointed to Washington. O'Hara then offered his sword to Washington, who also refused and motioned to Major General Benjamin Lincoln. We talked about him before, too. Not any relationship at all to Abraham Lincoln. Okay? But now, why did Washington do that? Because it was a breakdown in the code of honor. Okay? If General Cornwallis was not going to be man enough to come out and surrender, because he's surrendering for the whole nation of Great Britain, if he's not man enough to come out and do that, then we're not going to then accept it in a typical protocol. Instead, Washington is going to turn it over to General Benjamin Lincoln, his second in command. The surrender finally took place when Lincoln accepted the sword of Cornwallis's deputy. However, it was not Cornwallis's sword. It was O'Hara's sword. Do you want to know where that sword is today of Cornwallis? If you ever are going to England, if you're ever visiting England, I'll give you the address of the noble individual that to this day owns that sword, has in his possession. It was a offspring of, through the years, obviously, but of the family line of Cornwallis, and they own it in Britain today. Okay, it's there. Okay, to be seen. Yale President Ezra Stiles would later write, quote, "Doubtless inspired by the supreme illuminator of great minds, God, were the joint councils of a Washington and a Rochambeau in that grand effort of generalship with which they deceived and astonished a Clinton." That's when they came out of New York and they didn't know they'd left, and eluded his vigilance in their transit by New York and rapid marches for Virginia. Was it not God that both the Navy and Army should enter the Chesapeake at the same time? Who but God could have ordained the critical arrival of the Gallic fleet so as to prevent and defeat the British and assist and cooperate with the combined armies in the siege and reduction of Yorktown? End of quote. The timetable now, this is interesting, the timetable between the surrender of Yorktown, 1781, and the official end of the war, 1783, was an extremely fragile and dangerous time. George Washington once again canceled his plans to return to Mount Vernon for a holiday in order to remain with the army now headquartered in Newburgh, New York, along the Hudson River. The soldiers, now here's the critical time, the soldiers had not been paid for months. Now, if you remember back in Valley Forge, that was an issue there. The men didn't have goods, they didn't have supplies, and they didn't get their pay. Okay, the soldiers had not been paid for months. The paper money Congress had previously issued was worthless. There were rumors that their promised pensions would be canceled. The officers, the very backbone of the army, were disgruntled to a point of mutiny. Some of them called a meeting to plan a march to Philadelphia demanding payment by Congress. General Washington was not invited to the meeting. He had always enjoyed the trust and respect of his officers. This was a serious matter. His ability to command was at stake. George Washington spent much of the day carefully drafting his best arguments to persuade the officers of his genuine support and his continued influence to see they receive justice. Entreating them to be patient a little longer and to trust their elected officials, he also noted that all they had gained for their country could be irrevocably lost by behaving rashly. At the appointed hour of the ad hoc meeting, Washington, looking every inch the general, strode unannounced into the front of the room. He was past 50 years old by then, having spent nearly 20% of his lifetime with the army. He spoke briefly and to the point and indicated that he had received a letter from Congress that he wished to read. Then he fumbled in his waistcoat, doing something his officers had never seen him do before. He took out a pair of spectacles. Washington apologized to the men, saying that he had, quote, not only grown gray, but nearly blind in the service of his country. It is said that the officers were moved to tears at this singular personal confession from their esteemed general. With this one humble gesture and disclosure, Washington averted a mutiny. I find that really, to me, really moving, really touching. On October 11th, 1782, the Congress of the Confederation passed, quote, "It being the indispensable duty of all nations to offer up their supplications to Almighty God, the United States in Congress assembled, do hereby recommend it to the inhabitants of these states in general to observe the last Thursday of November next as a day of solemn thanksgiving to God for all his mercies." On February 6, 1783, George Washington wrote to Nathanael Greene, quote, "It will not be believed that such a force as Great Britain has employed for 8 years in this country could be baffled in their plan of subjugating it by numbers infinitely less, composed of men oftentimes half-starved, always in rags, without pay, and experiencing at times every species of distress which human nature is capable of undergoing." On May 18, 1783, again, Yale President Ezra Stiles wrote, quote, "Who but God could have ordained the critical arrival of the Gallic French fleet so as to assist in the siege of Yorktown? It is God who had raised up for us a powerful ally, a chosen army, a naval force, who sent us a Rochambeau to fight side by side with the Washington in the Battle of Yorktown." End of quote. On September 3rd, 1783, the war officially ended with the signing of the Treaty of Paris. Signers included Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay. All three obviously play an extremely important part in the whole foundation. The Treaty of Paris closed. Check this out. The Treaty of Paris, which ended the war, there's two things I want to point out about it. And one of them is the Christian tone of it, and then secondly, how the Americans are giving an olive leaf to the British. The Treaty of Paris closes, "In the name of the most holy and undivided Trinity, it having pleased the divine providence to dispose the hearts of the most serene and most potent Prince George III by the grace of God, King of Great Britain, and of the United States of America, to forget all past misunderstandings and differences, done at Paris this 3rd day of September, in the year of our Lord 1783. So first it says, "In the name of the most holy Trinity," okay? Again, it just befuddles me to read modern scholars saying we weren't a Christian nation. It was just a minor abstract thing. When in reality, every week what we're seeing is they were totally dependent on God. They interpreted everything in terms of was God there or wasn't God there. Again, George Washington was a key factor in this. The second thing is, so they hand out an olive branch. Let's forget. I mean, we've just won, okay? Let's forget what's gone before us. Let's work together from here on out. In those articles of capitulation, what they would do is they'll let the officers go back to England, and then they'll let the loyalists here in America. They had a boat that was used, and the Americans knew that they couldn't touch it. They didn't have to, how would you say, investigate it to see what was going on. It was allowed to take loyalists out. From reading it, sounds to me like most of the loyalists ended up in Canada. That's where most of the loyalists seemed to migrate to, meaning a loyalist, meaning a person that favored Great Britain and sided with them in the war, and in some cases fought. And we saw that happen also with Jane McCrae. Okay, some of them left and went to England. Some went to the British West Indies, and then some stayed and were naturalized. They became citizens here after the war was over. It just depended, but they were given safe passage as a result of the Articles of Capitulation. Then in his farewell orders on November 2nd, 1783, Washington stated, quote, "The singular interpositions of providence. That's how he starts. This is him looking back now. Following the signing of the Treaty of Paris, here's how he looks back on the past 8 years. The singular interpositions of providence in our feeble condition were such as could scarcely escape the attention of the most unobserving, while the perseverance of the armies of the United States through almost every possible suffering and discouragement for the space of 8 long years was little short of a standing miracle. So there I think he very succinctly and powerfully puts it. We were weakened. We had to have God show up. And then in addition to that, our men were so brave going through horrendous conditions. You remember Valley Forge? They don't even have any socks or shoes on. They're leaving their footprints and trails of blood as they're walking around. So it's that combination. And that's what faith is all about. Faith is, well, not, I don't want to use that verse. Without faith, it is impossible to please God. Faith is 2 things. Faith is believing God, asking for God's help, submitting oneself to God, even unto death. And then when you get to the end of your extremities, God often shows up. Okay? It takes both working. We have to do our part to do the very best we can, but then we're reliant on God because all of us are but dust. Okay? On November 8th, 1783, Massachusetts government, John Hancock, proclaimed, quote, the citizens of these United States have every reason for praise and gratitude to the God of their salvation. I do appoint the 11th day of December next, the day recommended by the Congress to all the states, to be religiously observed as a day of thanksgiving and prayer, that all the people may then assemble to celebrate that he hath been pleased to continue to us the light of the blessed gospel, that we also offer up fervent supplications to cause pure religion and virtue to flourish and to fill the world with his glory. I think that was Sunday's message, right? The glory, to fill the world. That's how they envisioned it. It goes right back to 1607. By the way, the Battle of the Capes, where you have de Grasse and Graves fighting, Britain against French, it was at the Cape Henry. That's the Cape, one of the 2 capes they were talking about right there. Let me see if there's anything else I wanted to bring up. Oh, let's show the memorial. Okay, so from a distance, this is the Yorktown Memorial. I want you to notice a couple of things. Hey, go to Lady Liberty on top first. Let's go to Lady Liberty. Okay. So that's where she stands, her hands out, welcoming the new nation. And then down below it, let's go to the close-up of the 13 ladies. Okay, these 13 represent what? 13 colonies, yes. Okay, and then on the base of it are these words: one country, one constitution, one destiny. It's very succinct, right? One country, one constitution, one destiny, which is very much like the first coin we talked about a couple weeks ago. The first coin on the backside had the 13 rings, and in the middle, what did it say? 3 words. We are one. E pluribus unum becomes. But we are one. Well, we are one. One country, one constitution, one destiny. You can see the unity that was going on there. And that was, to me, what was so frustrating about last night. And I thought the president put it well. I could cure cancer, and you'd still sit on your hands. Because you wouldn't give in. You can't even stand up for these kids that were being honored there for one reason or another, or posthumously being honored, because that unity is what both the American Revolution, they knew how important that was, and both the Civil War. Same thing. We have to come out of this with unity. We have to come this in one accord. And anyway, so questions or thoughts about the Battle of Yorktown?
I have something to say.
Yes, sir.
It's been a phrase going in my head. I don't know if it pertains to this, but it's a quote that's been hit in my head. One by land and 2 by sea. Where'd that come from? sea.
What do we have? One if by land, two if by sea. Yeah. And who was that that said that? Yeah. Yeah, Paul Revere. Yeah. One if by land, two if by sea.
What was the answer?
Paul Revere, I believe. Huh? Yeah.
Two by sea.
So that's, yeah. Again, that's a down a little different track because what we're really trying to show here is the miracles of the American Revolution. Paul Revere, other people are very important in it, but again, we're just kind of really focused on the miracles. Yeah.
Well, I mean, when you said the Treaty of Paris in 1783, it
Yes.
made me think of right now France, Macron, and Keir Starmer doing this whole
French English thing.
nothing new under the sun. Where they're saying, "Hey, we need America.
Yeah.
We have God on our side." And then the second thing was, did you see they give them 15 today?
Yeah. No, I saw yesterday's.
That sheets today was talking about the Battle of Princeton.
Is that right?
It's so indicative how BCF is years ahead of some of the stuff that will be coming online. Said it, what, 10
Well,
years?
yeah. And again, it's important for us to discern what the Holy Spirit is saying, and then you're going to get if you're in the right place, you're going to get the confirmations. You just keep on plowing ahead, and that's why I said this is a reconstruction project we're doing here. We're trying to reconstruct what's been swiped out of our culture, especially because of 62, 63, when God was taken out of the schools. So no teacher within their right mind would say, "Hey, today, kids in class, we're going to study. We're going to study how God intervened in the American Revolution." They're not going to do that. They're going to be hauled into HR because God's out of there now. We don't want to hear, all that stuff. So we've had robbed from us the stories that are, to me, are essential as the book, the Torah is to the Jewish people, and the New Testament to us as Christians, because we have the one pure example, if I can put it that way, of the same God of the Old and New Testament showing up to cause us to be able to become a nation. I said in the first service, I said, look, General Washington was not perfect. He had great character, but the reason why guys were continually attacking, trying to take his power, is that they questioned whether he had the ability to be a general in war because he made some bad calculations on things. I mean, God used, none of us are perfect, but we needed a man with his type of character that people would respect, and then God showing himself up. So when he made remember the first battle, Brooklyn Heights, he misguessed which way the British were coming, and it caused them to get a lot of people killed because he made a mistake. Okay, he wanted to go and fight in New York. Okay, when the guys were up there not fighting the British and the Americans before they came down to the Southern Campaign, George Washington wanted to go and to take New York because Britain had New York at that, just like they had Charleston in South Carolina. And Rochambeau and a couple other people really persuaded him not to go into New York. And it would have been a mistake to go into New York, considering how it ended up, because at Yorktown they were able to win the war. So whether it's, nobody is perfect, and we're not looking for perfection. What we're looking for is people that do the very best they can and are trusting in God, because then who gets all the glory? God gets the glory. Okay? We honor people. We certainly honor George Washington in terms of being the father of this country, of all that he did. But to me, the most important thing is his trust in God. And I wouldn't care if he lost a whole bunch of battles if he was trusting in God, and the end result was they won. Does that make sense to everybody? I mean, you got to take a look at this thing practically. There's nobody in here that's perfect.
Oddly enough, with these monuments that we're looking at right here, I mean, they're not going to tear down an 85-foot monument, but they just did try to do all those others.
I would suggest to you if we had kept going in the direction we were going, all of them would have been brought down, including that one. And there'd be every rationalization on why that was important to do.
I made my way down south today, and I was like, oh, I'll take the coast, and then I just wound up at Soledad, and I went around it and said a prayer up there.
Amen.
And I was like, wow.
That was a major victory.
Oh, yeah, and it has the actual victory. Where I ended up crossing, it showed in 2015 when that one atheist was fighting that cross.
Yep.
I was like, wow. I mean, that's bizarre. Because I went down there in 2015.
And if you look at what President Trump is attempting to do, you can see that what he's basically saying is we're not going to be ruled by these little groups of people that the Lord gave me something. I was going to bring it up tomorrow. And that is that unfortunately, a lot of people are looking at the world through what I call sideshow colored glasses. Now, if you remember what a sideshow is, that's where the guy's out there hawking and he's saying, come in, you'll never believe what you're going to see in here. The three-legged chicken, or the woman with the beard, whatever it is. In other words, taking some crazy thing and trying to make it real. And so a lot of people today are looking at craziness. Hey, what is wrong with guys competing with girls in sports as long as they identify as a girl? What's wrong with that? Are you some sort of, bigot or whatever they're going to call you? See, because they're looking at it through sideshows. They're seeing it as if they're the barker trying to get people to come into the sideshow. Not what reality is, but the sideshow. And those sideshows are wackos.
Yeah, Pastor, what about, I know you're President Trump with the young people.
Yeah.
Like you said, a lot of the congressmen, what were the young people being honored?
Well, DJ, young black young man, very articulate. If you had a chance to hear his, they did a thing the next day with the people that were there, an interview. Man, that kid was articulate. He has had brain surgery. They expected him to live 5 months, and he's in his 6th year. He's always had in his heart he wanted to serve as a policeman. Isn't that what it was? He was a policeman. And his dad had him there, and you can see the scars all over his head from the surgeries. And President Trump honored him for his perseverance and for his commitment to want to help America. And so what he did is he made him an honorary member of the Secret Service. And the head of the Secret Service gave him a badge and everything. So that was one. The whole time, in honoring the kid, everybody except the Democrats were standing, applauding. They were sitting there like this. Then, yeah, they had little things, little signs they were putting up and all sorts of stuff. And then another one was a mother of a 12-year-old girl who was ravagely attacked and beaten to death. By some I think San Salvadorians or something like that. And so he was pointing out to the mother about what they were trying to do to pass bills to never have that again, and that's why he shut down the borders and all. Again, standing ovation, a lengthy ovation, and then but the people on the left were seated the whole time. And
Most of the Democrats didn't like it, hate Trump.
well, Trump pointed to them and said, I could cure cancer, and you wouldn't applaud it. They hate him. It's all individualized now. They just hate him. And it's a funny thing for us as believers and those that believe that God is doing something now. I've had so many people say, I just wish that President Trump wouldn't talk so much. Could he just keep his mouth shut? Because it's offensive. A lot of the things the way he says things. But the point is, he's a businessman who wrote the book The Art of the Deal, and he knows how to push over and then to withdraw. He did it today. He put the 25% tariffs on both Canada and Mexico, but then he came back today because he had a discussion with automakers, and he said it's going to apply to everything but the autos. I will guarantee you, he already knew that he was going to do that. He pushed a total tariff so he could put himself in a negotiating position to be able to back down some. He did the same thing with wanting Canada to be the 51st state of the United States. Okay, that's the way he operates. He just says that so everybody gets all up in the arms, but in reality, he wants a fair deal. He feels that we have been taken advantage of for years, and now that we have a $37 trillion debt, we have to even the playing field so we can become solvent again. So, because one of his desires is to balance the budget. So, anyway,
You know who balanced the budget?
Clinton.
One president,
Clinton.
a liberal Democrat,
Yes, he did.
the budget.
Yes, he did.
So,
Are you going to argue with me that the Democrats today are the same ilk as Clinton was back then?
No,
No.
it was like a reasonable.
Yeah, exactly. Well, listen, I've shared many times. I always saw myself historically as a social democrat and a fiscal Republican. That's why I was involved in Watts in the Wilshire district of L.A. That's why I have had such a close relationship with Pastor Hector and the Spanish Victory outreaches.
Americans, Jewish Americans, everybody.
I believe that when operating correctly, the Democrats and Republicans working together make a more perfect union. Because the heart of some of the things the Democrats want to do, the fiscal part for the Republicans, if you can meet and work together, it'll be a more perfect union.
You can't say that anymore.
Well, not right now. Right now you can't. It's just so polarized.
The one thing that President Trump did that wasn't right, he does speak too much sometimes, and I voted for him. He's a lot better than
Yeah.
he says about, he didn't serve it in the war. He
Right.
got out like a lot of rich guys. I don't know, because he had the money to get out.
Sure.
But John McCain, who was a hero, did serve. His family had money, and he was a hero.
Yeah.
And then he makes a joke about the guys rich.
Right.
Well, I like heroes that don't get caught.
Right.
And that was totally wrong.
McCain's a traitor.
That was totally wrong. McCain wasn't a traitor.
What JC is saying is he became what the terminology rhino stands for. In other words, Republican in name only.
Well, he voted with Trump like 91% of the time, and just because he voted for Obamacare, I know you don't like that, but he voted for Trump most of the time.
Yeah.
But I'm not impressed with just because somebody votes with Trump 100% of the time.
No, you'd have to be on the Democratic side because they'll always vote 100% for their side.
Now they
Yeah, now we're talking about. So again, and again, you proved my point. You're pointing out something to you that made President Trump not perfect. Okay. No, I'm not talking about the McCain thing. I'm talking about talking the way he talks because again, he pushes the envelope all the way over. So he refers to the guy in North Korea as Little Rocket Man. Right? Is that what he referred him to? Little Rocket Man. And that catches everybody, including him. What am I going to do with this? And then he goes and meets him and he shakes his hand. It's so nice to meet you. But that's the way he deals. And you might hate him for it or love him for it, but that's why.
And Putin is a murderer that was KGB.
Yes, unless you know it from what he's doing. He's not going to say in public that to him because it will ruin his negotiating position to try to get Zelensky and Putin to end the war. His number one desire there is the bloodshed stop. And so he's not in public going to insult one of the two parties. But he will push back on the one that he feels is the one that's going to have to move the most. And that's because...
Reagan, had much better public relations.
Absolutely.
He had humility. He didn't, I don't know what he did with the Russians, but I know the Berlin Wall, what he did there.
Yeah.
But he convinced the Russian president, remember, to capitulate. He wasn't like Trump at all.
No, not at all. But again, I can tell you some instances where he made big mistakes. I'm speaking of Ronald Reagan. Nobody's perfect, and the personalities are different. The bottom line is, does it move in a positive direction when it's all said and done? And when I mean positive, I mean more in line with what God wants, okay, in terms of freedom, justice. That's what I'm saying. Right now, we're in the children's moment, okay? You promote the children, you are going to be blessed, and you're going to be on the right side, and it's going to become apparent. If you come against it, if you sit on your hands when children are being honored, you're gonna look the part, and people are going to be turned off, and they're going to walk away from you. That's the moment we're in right now. Again, it's important, and you bring up a good point, Stanley, and that is when we're analyzing world events, American events, you have to try to get above the personalities, realizing that if Jonathan Cahn is right, and Trump is like Jehu in the Bible. Jehu's personality was just like Trump's, okay? You've got to be able to look beyond that and see if God is working it. Because God spoke and worked through a donkey, a jackass in the Bible. So that says to me that he can work through all different types of personalities of humans. You can be like a jackass, or you can be like the widow, or the woman that only had a little bit of money. It's just in that regard. Anyway, so thank you for the comment. Yes, Philip.
I might be considered a moderate, but I have to tell you that I really love that speech.
It was wonderful.
I, you know,
Yep.
I've been on the fence. You know, I've put myself in that direction often. I'm not trying to say I haven't, but you know, but when I heard that speech from Trump yesterday, I heard the whole thing, and I was just praising God.
Amen.
I was praising God. You know, yeah, I was waiting for that one moment that he was going to say something.
Well, he did.
Maybe go back on that.
Hey, wait. Well, Pocahontas once wore.
Well,
So for a lot of people, that was offensive.
well, you know what?
It is offensive.
Governor Trudeau.
It is offensive.
So what I'm saying,
Calling somebody a name is offensive.
well,
Maybe she wants more, but I'm not talking about calling her a name.
yes, I understand exactly what you're saying. So you're,
But it was a blessing for me because, you know, I haven't had a blessing, you know, where I can listen to Trump and just completely just agree.
Yeah.
And I know my sister Donna is right about that. But in all honesty, I was listening to I felt like, you know, for the first time that the country was going to be reestablished as America.
amen.